Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome back Grover Norquist, founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, to discuss his new book, End the IRS Before It Ends Us. Grover, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you.
Grover, back in 1776, before we started on our journey, the American colonists were taxed to about 2% of their annual income. Where are we now?
Closer to about 30% if you add federal, state, and local together, about 20% at the federal level, national level, 10% state and local.
How has that grown over time?
Well, every time you have a war, they raise taxes for the war, and they tend to keep them in whole or in part still in place. I go through in the book 14 different ways in which the politicians, elected officials lie to us and talk us into raising taxes, like the land shark in the Saturday Night Live routine, where it keeps trying to knock on the door and get into your house to eat you. And taxes keep giving you different arguments. Oh, this will be a tax on the rich. It'll be a tax on foreigners. It'll be a tax on other people. It'll be a temporary tax. It'll replace a different tax. They've got many ways they've talked us into it, unfortunately. And the idea that when you have one tax, like a property tax that people hate, when New Jersey said, let's have a sales tax in order to bring the property taxes down in 1965, you ended up with both high property taxes and high sales taxes. And so in 1976, 10 years later, they add an income tax. So now you have an income tax and a sales tax and a property tax in New Jersey, all of them high. If you have a tapeworm and somebody tries to talk you into swallowing a second or third tapeworm in order to discipline the first tapeworm, not a good idea.
But doesn't something have to pay for the bloated size of government?
Well, something has to pay for government. The question is, how much government do we want? How much can we afford? And how much is necessary? Obviously, we need an army strong enough to keep the Canadians on their side of the border. You want to have a judicial system. You want property rights protected. Beyond that, when the government stops protecting your right to be left alone, it then becomes intrusive of your life and destructive of human liberty, not conducive to it.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because you make some new allegations in your book that are quite surprising. And in particular, you build a case that says that the IRS was a decisive player in electing the president in 2012. What's that all about?
Well, when Obama was elected in 2008 and came into office early 2009, it only took a few months for the American people to react very strongly to the threat of Obamacare taking over their control of health care. The TARP bailout, the second round of the TARP bailout, was showered in government spending. They announced $1 trillion in spending increases over the next decade just because. And then there was the $800 billion worth of stimulus on top of that. And then there was going to be a tax on energy. So there was this incredible tsunami heading straight for the forehead of the American people, and they got scared straight, and they went out into the streets, and somewhere between 600 and 1,000 rallies with maybe 1 million people in them around the week of April 15th, 2009. No tax had been raised, just people reacting to overspending. Well, I remember the taxpayer movement of 78, 79, 80 that gave us Reagan and Kemp Roth and Proposition 13 in California and Proposition 2.5 in Massachusetts.
It motivated a lot of people.
Yeah. Then you had groups in each state that pooled a little bit of money, rented an office, hired a couple staff people, and they grew into powers in those states. What happened to the Tea Party was that they had all this energy and they swamped the 2010 elections, elected a Republican House, many Republicans in the Senate, changed the nature of the House and the Senate. But moving forward, they didn't have the structures because as soon as Obama realized what was happening, the word went out to the IRS, and they refused to give 501c4 status, which means corporate status, to these new groups, which would allow them to set up a bank account and raise some money from neighbors and friends and have a phone and so on. So it stunted the growth of this tremendously powerful grassroots movement that certainly, according to a wonderful study by the American Enterprise Institute with scholars from Harvard and Stockholm and AEI, they looked at where there was a rally in one city or state and where there was a rally planned in another city but was rained out. And they compared voter turnout in 2010 after the Tea Party rally that happened in one area and that didn't in the other.
That's an interesting experiment.
So you were actually comparing apples and apples. It turns out that the very act of bringing 100, 200, in some cases 500, 1,000 people together for a rally and meeting with each other and saying, you mean I'm not alone thinking this? And, oh, I met my neighbor here. And let's exchange phone numbers, and let's exchange emails, and let's set up a Facebook place to meet. Those structures affected turnout in the next election so that somewhere between 3 and 6 million more Republicans voted just due to the rallies in 2009 and what flowed from there.
So you mean social activism works?
Well, I had always thought that our friends on the left were kind of being silly when they'd have these large 100,000-person gatherings on the mall. I thought it was because they didn't have jobs. But in point of fact, rallies work. They matter. They get people excited and determined and convinced they're part of a movement.
You know, you call this whole thing a conspiracy that was held completely out in the open. What did you mean by that?
Well, people have been looking for the email from the president or the White House to Lois Lerner, who is the woman managing the attacks on the Tea Party. There may be an email since they destroyed their emails. One assumes that the reason they destroyed the emails is that there's something incriminating there rather than something that would exonerate them. But you don't need an email because the president said in his State address, somebody has to do something about this. You saw on October 19th, 2010, Lois Lerner saying, they're all screaming at me, do something before the election about all these new groups starting up. So she announced publicly that she was getting this pressure. There were public letters from Democratic senators saying, do something about these new groups starting up and trying to get organized. So the communication from the political people in the Senate and the White House, the president, and Lois Lerner at the IRS is clear, and we know it happened, and she said it happened.
And that makes it okay, right?
No, it's still illegal. It's not the government's business to decide not to provide services to people who they disagree with politically.
You tell a story of a Mrs. Engelbrecht in your book. Share those with us.
Well, this is one of the really awful ones. She was brought up and testified before Congress. And it turns out that she was visited by the IRS and OSHA, and all sorts of government entities started poking around once she decided she wanted to file to set up a little C3, C4, so she could get organized and organize her local community. She was also interested in True the Vote, which is a group she helped organize, which would make sure that real people vote and non-real people don't vote to stop voter fraud. And she was targeted and asked all sorts of questions. How often do you pray? What candidates have you given money to? Who have you talked to in the last X number of years? None of the government's business. All designed to harass a conservative trying to get organized.
And what was the pretext for doing this? What were they what did they claim they were investigating?
Well, they weren't really clear about it. They just were trying to decide whether you were a real C4, and the claim was that if you're trying to do something other than what you said you were going to do. You know, if they asked all groups, conservative and liberals, you might say, well, that's pretty heavy-handed government, but they don't. And I served in 1998 on the congressionally sponsored commission on restructuring the IRS. I asked the head of the IRS then, I said, all my conservative groups, this is during Clinton, the conservative friends are being audited, many of them, and I talked to my left of center friends, and none of them are being audited. Why are you targeting people on politics? This was under Clinton. And they said, we're not. We have a very fair way of doing it. Could you tell us about it? Oh, no, it's a secret. You'll have to trust us.
So, Grover, how could this have been extensive enough to actually tip a presidential election?
Well, because as you look at the numbers, the study that American Enterprise Institute did said that it drove between 3.2 and 5.8 million additional voters to the polls in 2010. Then you go ahead to 2012, when Obama got 65 million votes and Romney got 61 million votes. Romney was up 1 million from 4 years earlier. Had you seen the same push upward at the 2012 race that you saw in 10, Romney would have had a majority of the vote, and you'd have had a different president. The left was wise to try and kneecap the movement of taxpayers and citizens who were scared by all the spending. I mean, it was a taxpayer movement. It was an anti-spending movement, which has never happened in American history. I would have told you 2 weeks before the Tea Party hit, they couldn't do that. That you'd have to wait until taxes were raised to get people mad. They didn't wait.
So the moral of this story is every incumbent president should use the IRS to harass his political opponents.
One worries that a left-wing presidential candidate would learn just that lesson. And that I think the second part of that lesson for any Republican congressman or senator is change the law, and that there are 7 laws being legislation introduced to pass 7 laws to restrict the IRS this April 15th week in 2015.
So, Grover, in your book, you bring attention to something in the Constitution called the Uniform Clause. Tell us about that.
Well, when the federal government said, here are the rules on taxing, spending, setting up an army, they were reacting to very real threats that they saw, and they wrote about this as, why did we do it this way? Why can the military only be funded for 2 years at a time? Because they were afraid of standing armies.
This is back in 1789.
Yes, back during the Constitution, when they were writing the Constitution. And one of the things they wrote down was they wanted taxation to be uniform. And they wrote about this, saying that one of the greatest fears in a democracy is that a majority will decide to tax a minority, that the North will decide to tax the South, or the East will decide to tax the West, or farmers will tax businessmen, or, get yourself a majoritarian party and you can tax the other. And they said the way to protect against that is to have in the Constitution a requirement that all taxes be uniform. And by that they meant a flat rate tax and taxes that didn't just hit one part of the country rather than another. And we've lost that thought, or the courts have not enforced it.
And how did the passage of the 16th Amendment allowing for an income tax change that?
Well, it didn't. And the good news is that when the original income tax was put in, there was one temporarily north and south during the Civil War, which ended in 1871, a while after the Civil War was over. But then there was another one in 1894. The courts struck it down. It was a graduated income tax. And the court said, hey, violates the Uniform Clause, you're out of here. When the income tax constitutional amendment was put in, they did not remove the Uniform Clause. They simply said you can tax income. The Uniform Clause stands. And just as the Second Amendment was rediscovered after the politics supported expanding Second Amendment rights, I believe the day will come when courts rule that the Uniform Clause requires a single rate tax on any income tax.
Grover, one of the themes in your book is the intimate connection between taxation and war, both as cause and effect. And most interesting was your speculation that the income tax allowed the U.S. to get involved in World War I. How so, and how would the outcome have been different had we not gotten involved?
You see real hesitation throughout history by kings and dukes and elected officials to get involved in wars because they know how devastating and expensive they are. We passed the income tax legislation, the constitutional amendment, and the laws to allow one just prior to the First World Wars in Europe. Then you had politicians who could ratchet up the amount of money the federal government was going to get by taking not just people who made more than $11 million a year. That was the original threshold. The income tax was only on people who in today's dollars made more than $11 million a year. You can imagine you could get that passed because everyone said, that's not me. And because it was easy to take that number down and dramatically expand it, it made it possible for the United States to enter World War I on the massive level that it did. Whereas before they might have either stayed out or simply played a naval role in protecting American shipping.
And many have said because of us getting involved in a war that seemed to be heading for stalemate, the peace was very different.
Oh, very sadly, yes, because the Americans jumped in. You had everything from the Russian Revolution to a humiliating defeat for the Germans instead of a negotiated defeat, or, everybody stays in place and stops throwing things at each other, which is the way you'd ended previous wars. The French could have gotten Alsace-Lorraine back, and then everybody would have been back in their little borders. Because you had that, and it festered with Germany, and Russia was where it was, the humiliating piece is one of the things that led to German aggression in World War II. And so you can blame the end of World War I for making World War II much more likely.
Mm-hmm.
And again, American participation funded by and made possible and encouraged by, hey, there's an easy way to raise taxes and raise a lot of money at any given time. It's called the income tax. Without that, would the United States have decided to do things the way they did entering World War I? I don't think so. Without that, would World War I have ended the way it did? Certainly not. Might we have avoided World War II? Possibly.
Would have been a different place. You describe a number of colorful taxes in the book, one of which you called the perfect tax, which was the federal excise tax on long-distance phone calls to pay for the Spanish-American War back in 1898. What made it so perfect?
Well, here you had a war with Spain. Spain was a declining power, so all of the lies that politicians tell to talk people into agreeing to a tax increase were there. It's a temporary tax. Wars don't last forever. It's a hidden tax. It's going to be stuck on the back of your phone bill. 3, it's only on rich people because back in 1898, only rich people had phones. They cost about $5,000 at the time, and it was only a tax on long-distance phone bills. So really only a certain amount of people would pay for it at all. Only rich people. It would be temporary. It was a war. Are you patriotic or not? And it was a hidden tax. For all those reasons, it got put in, and it lasted 100 years. Very soon, everybody had a phone. Very soon, everybody was making what were then considered long-distance phone calls. It remained hidden, the FET, federal excise tax, at the bottom of your phone bill with all those other little add-on fees. And it died when taxpayer groups shined a light on it and said, do you know you are paying the Spanish-American War tax? Are you aware the government's treating you like an idiot and still collecting a tax on a war that's long over? And at that point, we began the campaign, which eventually wore it down. But it took 8 different court cases to do it in. Because what the tax said was all long-distance phone bills, which are billed based on time and distance. Well, a long time ago, they quit doing time and distance. It's just how long are you on the phone, right? It doesn't matter whether you call Missouri or California. Well, ever since then, that tax has not been legal. And even the Bush administration went to court a couple of times arguing about whether what the definition of the word is. Eventually, they threw in the towel, and we finally won. But this is the last, you know how they used to tell you this is the last veteran of the Civil War died, you know, X number of years after the war. The final veteran of the Spanish-American War was the Spanish-American War tax. It lasted longer than everybody else.
We're currently living under a tax and spend deal called the sequestered deal, which is having quite an impact on budgeting in Washington. You call that Barack Obama's fortuitous, boneheaded mistake. Explain how that happened.
Well, Obama was convinced that the modern Republican Party is a slave to the Pentagon. And so he was trying to get a $1.4 trillion tax increase instead of significant spending restraint as part of the deal. So he wasn't getting anywhere because the Republicans in the House and Senate had all signed the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, and they were holding it. Well, every once in a while, somebody would have an impure thought that they'd make public on CNN, and the Democrats would latch, oh, maybe it's one guy you're talking about, right? So the D's kept thinking, we can get them to agree to tax increase. The Republicans kept saying no. So Obama said, here's how I'll trick you. I'll agree to taking it all in spending restraint, giving the Republicans everything they wanted. But it's going to be evenly limiting the growth of spending on the Pentagon
50-50.
And on domestic discretionary spending. And he assumed that when Republicans got back and looked at it and realized that it would require the Pentagon to do some reforming, as well as everybody else, the Republicans would come back, a hat in hand, begging for a tax increase to replace the Pentagon spending cuts and all the other spending cuts.
And that would be the end of Grover Norquist.
That would certainly be the end of the Republican Party opposed to tax increases, yeah. Then the question would be, why do you have two parties? It would have been a phenomenal victory for Obama. The problem is he missed that the Republicans, after the Tea Party victory in 2010, were very serious about not spending more money. They were willing to tell the Pentagon that they needed to reform government spending, and they didn't want to give them a blank check. And so the president kept waiting and waiting and waiting for the Republicans to show up and offer to exchange the spending restraint for tax increases. Never happened. Hasn't happened yet, and the Republicans quite wisely and understandably consider this their great victory. The president made a misjudgment on where the Republicans were, and the Republicans took advantage of it. We've dropped federal spending from 24% of the economy to 20% because of this sequester.
On that one deal.
On the one deal. And it goes on for another 10 years. All the Republicans have to do now is work to reform government spending, both in the Pentagon and outside the Pentagon. There's a cap. The president can't do anything about it. And then elect a president and pass the Ryan budget plan, and you're home free.
So after all this, Grover, and again, looking back over your book, how do we end the IRS? And if we do, who pays for government?
Well, we need to decide how much government we want. And so the first step to getting rid of the IRS is to dramatically reduce the size and scope of government. Block granting all the welfare programs out to the states, as we did with aid to families with dependent children. Reforming all government pensions, federal, state, local, and making them 401ks, IRAs, defined contribution pensions, rather than Detroit-style defined benefit pensions, which blow up and bankrupt a city, a state, an industry, the country. Those reforms can push down the cost curve of government to where we don't need as many taxes as we have. And I would argue that we're seeing this at the state level already. There are 9 states without an income tax. Well, how can you run a state without an income tax? Well, 9 states do. Why don't we look at how they do it? And that number is going to double in the next 10 years as Kansas and Arizona and Mississippi, Louisiana, North Carolina, Missouri are all looking at dramatically phasing out their income tax. Kansas, the law says, as revenue comes in above 2% growth over time, all additional revenue go down to permanently ratcheting down the income tax until it hits zero, corporate and individual. So in the old days, when you'd have some economic growth, the money would come in unexpectedly, and the unions would come and take it all and run away with it. Now, when money comes in beyond expectation, it goes to taxpayers in a permanent reduction of the income tax until the income tax ratchets down to zero. So we are 2 decades away from half the states in the country having zero income tax. At that point, I think people say, we used to think we had to have an income tax here in our state, and we don't, and things work better. Do we need an income tax at the national level? Well, as spending comes down, as the government sells off land and the value of underground oil and natural gas, there are trillions of dollars to be sold off of value, pay down debt. The government can be much more frugal if it tries.
Without 4 million lines of regulations and rules in the tax code, how does Washington do social engineering?
Well, the goal is to not have them do social engineering. We can tell the government, thank you very much for that kind invitation, but we'll pass on having you run our lives. That's why we graduate from high school and leave home, so that mom doesn't tell us what to do. And we don't get out of that just to have the federal government come in and micromanage the size of our light bulbs.
Grover, I've been to your Wednesday meetings, and it's fascinating to watch all the different groups come in with different agendas, but none seem to step on the other. You talk a little bit about the coalition of the left not really being made up of friends and allies, because at the end of the day, the money has to come from somewhere. What do you see on that side of the aisle?
Well, on the right, you have groups that simply want to be left alone, and their guns alone, their kids alone, their kids' education alone, their faith alone. And so we can all work together because we don't want anything from anybody else. But on the left, they all want more money from the government. And so as long as the government is not growing, they become in conflict. The left is made up of competing parasites. And if we don't let them eat taxpayers, they'll gnaw on each other.
I guess they didn't vote you Washington's funniest celebrity for nothing. Grover, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
That was Grover Norquist, founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, making his annual Tax Day appearance here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Please stop by realclearradio.org or YouTube to subscribe to our podcasts. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.